obelisco, which is the white, tall, thin monument in the center. And they put a huge sign that said, "Closed for liquidation," because this was the feeling in this country, that it was like an old car that, every single piece, valuable piece had been stripped, and they just left the carcass. It had that feeling. But there was also a feeling of rebellion, and there was a feeling of rebellion and rejection in the whole region. And Argentina, when we began this project, had just thrown out 5 presidents in 2 weeks. And they were trying to come up with alternatives in the rubble of this failed system. Now, in Bolivia, they didn't yet have Evo Morales, but the process that led to his election, to his historic election, had begun. And it really began in Cochabamba in a revolt against water privatization, which is always the most contentious piece of the privatization agenda because water is so essential to life. And so Bolivians had just successfully thrown out the Bechtel Corporation, which was just the symbol of this most contentious form of privatization. Lula had just been elected in Brazil, and that was still filled with hope and possibility at that time. And I could go on, but Latin America was certainly rejecting El Modelo in many different ways, in the streets and at the polls. So we were in Argentina when the war in Iraq began, and when the occupation began, when Paul Bremer arrived, with it guarded by his Blackwater guards, wearing his Brooks Brothers suits and his army boots, the uniform of the new economy, and announced Iraq open for business. First was the shock and awe military assault, and while Baghdad was still burning, according to Paul Bremer's own account, he opened the country wide open to unrestricted free trade. And George Bush announced, shortly after his mission accomplished moment, that it wouldn't just be Iraq, but that they would create a free trade zone for the whole of the Middle East. And it did, and then we found out that the reconstruction of Iraq would all be done by Western corporations. And we started to hear who had the contracts. General Electric, Bechtel. Bechtel, we heard, would be rebuilding the water system and the sewage system. And watching this from Latin America, I think, gave me a particular perspective, because there did seem to be some kind of a connection between the fact that this economic model was crashing in this continent. And in fact, Latin America, particularly the southern cone of Latin America, in the 70s, had been the first laboratory for the so-called Chicago's boys, who were the first people to take this radical neoliberal agenda of auctioning off the state that had been built up under Keynesian and developmentalist governments, and put it into practice in the real world. This was the first laboratory, and the laboratory was in revolt. So it seemed that there was a connection, and of course, as many of you know, I come out of this so-called anti-globalization movement that was never an anti-globalization movement, but was a movement against the globalization of El Modelo around the world. And we had been protesting against these very policies, against this very agenda, on the doorstep of the World Trade Organization, on the doorstep of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the institutions that had been globalizing this economic project, this Washington Consensus. And there did seem to be a difference in what we were seeing in Iraq, that these policies that were, where it was no longer possible to impose them through any veneer of consent, through arm twisting at trade summits or as conditions attached to an International Monetary Fund loan, were now just being imposed brutally in the aftermath of an illegal war under occupation, and I might say illegal even under the terms of an occupation